Hello, and welcome back to the Healthcare Executive Insights podcast. My name is Elliot Sloan with the Macallan Group. Today, we're very excited to introduce our guest, Dr. Rogers, the president of PTSD Foundation of America. Dr. Rogers, thanks for taking time to chat with us today.
Thanks for having me on. Looking forward to it.
Yeah, so let's start off by telling me a little bit about your professional background, your background as a veteran, and also we'll talk about your foundation.
Yeah, so I have a doctorate in human services with a specialty in veteran care. As a veteran myself, I really understand a lot of the issues and things that face from like the transitional perspective. But then as a combat vet too, as well, I'm able to look at things kind of differently from that first set of lenses and then provide working solutions that actually are effective with helping these guys transition back into everyday work, everyday life.
For someone who's not familiar, I mean, how many people can actually go into war, into a combat, and come back home and not have some degree of mental illness or fatigue? Like, how is it that you seem less affected than maybe other veterans?
Oh, don't get me wrong. Like I was very affected. So it's taken a lot of work to get to where I am at right now, currently. But you see, like there's something that innately happens to an individual whenever you have to do something that you've always been taught was wrong. So taking a life, even if I have the legal, the ethical, if I'm in a war zone, I have all of these, parameters set in place that say you will not, be arrested, you will not go to jail for killing, combatant X.
And you have to save your life.
That still has an effect on you. Because I mean, it's been consistently, ingrained in us as like this is the capital. Like if you kill someone, that's the most heinous of heinouses. But in combat, that's oftentimes what you have to do is, it's either kill or be killed. So it has an effect on an individual.
Sure. And how do you prepare someone for that, if you can even at all, until you've kind of walked that walk? I can't imagine there's something that can really get you mentally prepared for that.
Well, actually, there is, and the military is exceptionally good at it. It comes out of a branch of psychology called operant conditioning, or a branch of psychology of behaviorism. It's called operant conditioning. That's where you're taught how to, and I think it might be best just to kind of read like the definition of what that is, because it gets a better grasp of that. Let me look at this. So,
Yeah.
operant conditioning is a type of learning in which the frequency of a behavior depends on the consequence that follows that behavior. So, everything that is within the training part is a psychological manipulation. So, for example, when and this is weird, like when you just think about it for a minute, you're like, wait a minute, like this starts adding up, it starts making sense. So it starts out like with weapons training, and it's what is the form of what you're shooting at,
A target,
which is a what?
non-living target.
It's a silhouette of a person.
Sure.
So I'm already training psychologically that the target is a silhouette of a person.
Sure.
So I'm training consistently. So now when we move from having a paper target, we now move from having that to a plastic silhouette that actually has depth to it.
Yep.
So now as soon as I shoot it, it falls down.
Sure.
So I'm consistently training it. This is what I need to do in order to squeeze the trigger. are like when you go to the bayonet course of that. It is, yes, they're a tire and it is a, rubber thing in the center. But again, it's shaped like the silhouette of a person. And then you go a little bit further. So they have these things called miles gear. And miles gear are these little diodes that sit on your helmet and on your chest. And then you have a transmitter on your weapon. And every time you fire your weapon, it shoots a laser at the other person, enemy combatants. Miles gear. That's done purposely because here's the thing, the more that I can practice and train you on how to be comfortable with looking a person in the face and squeezing the trigger, even if it's just a training simulation, it comes down to that methodology and that thought process of like you train how you fight. So if I train you to consistently look at a person and not view them as a person, but as like a silhouette, then it's easier for me to pull the trigger on that person, on that the enemy combatant on the other side. So yes, they are psychologically conditioned to be able to pull the trigger on an enemy combatant, and for obvious reasons, that's the last thing you want on the battlefield, like two sides going against each other, and this person pulls up and this person hesitates to squeeze the trigger because of I've not been trained to do so. This person dies. So it's imperative that that is taught. But the problem that we run into is that, okay, yeah, I'm taught how to turn it on, but I'm never taught how to turn it off.
Sure.
And that's everything that's related to the training, not just the silhouette idea of it, but everything that's related to the conditioning of my mind. I'm taught how to think, act, know, be, do, and react very specifically to that environment. Everything that is in that environment is imperative for life. Like it's life or death. Like
Yeah.
everything relates to life or death. But once I'm out of that environment, what was once an acceptable approach now becomes a detriment to myself and everyone else around me.
Yeah. How much training do they do for preparation off the combat field?
Maybe a week.
Not enough.
No. But see, the crazy thing is like how much you're ramped up. So deployment cycles, not so much anymore, but when we were in the heart of OEF, which is Operation Iraqi Freedom and Operation Enduring Freedom, so Iraq and Afghanistan, 21 straight years of continuous combat. So people will be like, well, you deployed and you were only gone for, say maybe 6 months. Your high intensity deployments.
Sure.
Well, the problem with that is that's not true because okay, I go to a high intensity location for 6 months, even if it's just 6 months. But then I'm back, let's say I'm back for 12. Okay. Those 12 months that I'm back, I'm preparing for the 6 months that I'm going to. So it's a consistent high intensity type
Yeah.
revolution. Well, the problem with that is that once we get to a place to kind of where we're at right now, to where we don't have a lot of external conflicts that are going on, to where that requires a lot of military involvement, what do they do? Well, now they have to deal with the things. Well, in the military society and culture, help-seeking behavior is not a it is a frowned upon view.
Sure.
Um, and you could lose so many things from it. So most individuals that are in that system are taught to suck it up, drive on, in which in the combat environment, that is absolutely imperative for life and death. But again, anything outside of the combat environment, that becomes a detriment to their health and their life.
So, what do you think needs to happen to better prepare veterans for life after combat? Does it happen in the training that's happening for combat? Or does it have to happen after they've already been deployed and come back and you start a new set of training to how to reintegrate into normal life?
See, that's a very difficult thing having people like compartmentalize. In fact, I've only met one person who was very skillful at compartmentalizing, and I'm still watching them to see if they can maintain that compartmentalization of being able to separate the, combat and at home. The idea is, if I can't, it'd be very difficult for an individual to like try to tout that line while being in. So like if I either train you to be a war fighter, it'd be very difficult in that same breath to say, I'm going to teach you to be a war fighter now. I want to teach you to be a peace person.
Sure.
So the best thing to do is once they're done as a war fighter is then rechange the thought process, reprogram them, work through the trauma, work through the things that they've faced, and then get them to a better state of mind throughout that.
And how intensive is that reprogramming process?
Extremely intensive. It's
I
so
can only
intensive.
imagine.
It's so intensive that most organizations don't want to do it.
Yeah.
Um,
It's probably
because
just as much training, if not more, to prepare you from war than it is to unwind you from war.
and I think that it would probably be more intensive to undo some of those things. Because here's the thing that a lot of people don't really understand, okay, is that people have a tendency to separate the biological with the mental. But again, those two are interrelated and interconnected. So, for example, if I'm in a combat zone and I am consistently at thought of loss of life, limb, or anything else, right?
Sure.
On high alert, my adrenal glands are consistently secreting that. So I'm used to operating at a heightened level of intensity. And if it's 6 months, if it's 12 months, my body starts to do one of two things. My body, one, becomes accustomed to operating at that, or two, my body then starts to break down because operating at that super high level of intensity can only be maintained for a certain amount of time before the body starts breaking down. So if I'm now, my body has become so accustomed to operating at this high level that the expectation is, oh, well, you can go home now and you just shut it off.
Sure.
That's not how that works.
Yeah.
It's just, but that's the expectation. That's what a lot of individuals have, that, well, you're no longer in combat. Mm, maybe, maybe like geographically,
Yes.
I'm no longer in a combat zone. However, but my body has not had the opportunity to reset itself and to change and maybe peel down from that hypervigilance or whatever it is that I'm going through at that point in time, to be able to then, okay, I can reprocess now.
And what do you think is the big flaw with veteran healthcare for people coming back home? We all know it's a massive problem, PTSD. We all probably have family or friends that have been affected by it and have had family and friends that have served overseas. But it seems like it's a constant conversation of, we have this huge problem, but we don't know how to solve it. What do you see as the future for veterans healthcare turning a corner and becoming successful?
Well, I think one of the biggest ones is looking at it more from a holistic approach and looking at every aspect of the veteran's life, and looking at how they're interrelated, how they're connected, and then start giving an individual productive coping mechanisms to be able to deal with the things that they have faced. So there's pharmacology has its place.
Okay.
But pharmacology should not be used in every instance,
Yeah.
in which oftentimes many organizations, entities, that's the first pathway is pharmacology. So a lot of our veterans are not inept, they're just ill-equipped. They're ill-equipped to be able to deal with the things they face because they've never been given the productive coping mechanisms to be able to deal with it. They've developed maladaptive behaviors over the years. Now, like, okay, how do I then teach an individual how to deal with these specific things that they faced in their life and to face them productively? Because some individuals will like have that, well, is there a cure for PTSD? Well, I'd say no. And here's why. Trauma itself, like, let's say, for example, you were in a car and that car exploded. And then later, you're still able to, after some rehabilitation and different things like that, you can now get back into a car and you can drive a car. But always at the back of your mind will be like, is this car going to do what happened to me prior? That trauma is very ingrained in you, in who you are. Now, the problem that you run into is when that trauma then starts to dictate how you work around in life and how you do things. If you are now doing things to avoid that trauma, then that's a maladaptive behavior.
Sure.
So I'm not saying like, hey, if you're an alcoholic to like go to the bar and try to test it that way. No, that's not what I'm saying at all. But you will be able to um, function at a level to where you're not having to rely on the pharmaceutical interventions.
Sure.
And there's also a distinctly a problem with pharmaceutical interventions. Pharmaceuticals interventions, you build what's called tolerance to
Sure.
that, and you build a certain high level of resiliency to like, or that tolerance for that medication and what it's supposed to do. Okay, so what happens if you get to a point to where you're out and about and you're doing something and then you do not have the productive skills or productive coping mechanisms to be able to deal with it, to be able to peel yourself down, and you're relying on this medication, but then you get to a point where that you're exceeding that medication's limits. So what
Sure.
do? You go in and you talk to the doctor and be like, "Hey, I experienced this." So what does the doctor in turn do? The doctor in turn then gives you another medication. And it starts this vicious cycle of like, "Oh, well, now I'm on these 5 different meds. And now you're starting to have side effects. Well, let me give you a medication to counteract that side effect that drug 5 was doing. Now you're on 7. Now you're on 8. I can
Yeah.
speak to this from firsthand knowledge. I was on 22 different meds. I was on 7 narcotics and 3 psychotropics. And that's
Gee.
exactly what they did to me.
How do you function at that point? How do you even have any quality of life?
I didn't. So it's really strange from like '09 to 10, from 2009 to 2010. I do not have I only have bits and pieces of memories from that whole year.
You were fogged out.
I was so like over medicated that, for one, my wife literally thought I was going to die. She started to make end of life arrangements for me because I was so sick. I mean, my color was like very jaundiced.
Yeah.
I just I was gangly, maybe 150 pounds. Just I did not look healthy at all whatsoever, and she just thought I was going to die. Um, so that was a indirect relation to the amount of medications that I was taking.
Now, do you think it's the providers, the primary care physicians, family medicine doctors who are trying to help these veterans? They just don't have any other options. They don't know. any better solutions? So this is where we're at.
Well, think about how medicine is itself. While they like to call it like integrative, oftentimes it's very siloed, even so much as like specialty. So you have like occupational therapy, you have physical therapy, you have vocational therapy, you have all these different modalities, just even in surgery. Like you have how many different specializations you have in surgery? How many specializations do you have in cardiovascular, all of them. But see, the crazy thing is like they're only consistently looking and taught to look at that area where they're specialized in,
Yep.
and they treat that area. But then oftentimes the treatment of that area then also has other types of effects,
Sure.
cause versus causation. Um, yeah, I'm only specialized. Let's say I'm a heart doctor, a cardiovascular, and I'm looking at just the heart. Well, if I'm just looking at this, I'm not looking at everything else within that body. That's because that's where I'm siloed. That's where my goggles or my blinders are on for that specific thing. So
Sure.
I think
Tunnel
that's a
vision.
lot of the problem that we have in the current medical system is that, like, say the PCP, the PCP would probably be a pretty good, like, overall round doctor because they're looking at hundreds of different things.
Sure.
Um, so I think that's part of the issue, but you have to have those specialists. You do.
Yeah. But I think the problem is they don't all communicate. Their EHR systems, their notes, their patient records are not all being collaborated on. So it's like you start something with one provider and then it cuts off and you start something new with another provider. And there's no continuity or continuum of care, which is a massive problem in our healthcare system. Um, but going back to specifically, the veterans returning that suffer from PTSD, it feels like it almost should be mandatory to have therapy, mental, you know, uh, exercises, therapy sessions. People will have different degrees of their needs in that space, but um, do you think there is a potential value to making some type of requirement to seeing specialists after you come home from combat?
So unequivocally, yes. However, I throw a caveat within that. So the caveat is that let's start from the beginning. Okay. The Department of Defense does an absolutely phenomenal job with training an individual how to be a soldier, sailor, airman, marine. Well, the Department of Homeland Security does Coast Guard, and then you have the Space Force too as well. So that's what their sole purpose is to train them how to acclimate into this system and provide and do this mission. That's what they're good at. What they suck at is training them how to not be that. They don't know. But again, what that's like is that's like saying, hey, you have an individual who works at, and this is like by far the most generic example, but you get it. Is an individual works at McDonald's for 20 years, and then you put on the expectation of of a McDonald's employee in the McDonald's corporation to then train you to then go work at McDonald's or at Burger King. It's unrealistic. However, we have that same expectation on the Department of Defense. So I always throw this caveat out there. The simple fact that they're doing something is great, but it needs to be better. And the other thing is too, is that one thing I have consistently seen is that you will have the individuals that create this curriculum or that create this transition piece or whatever, probably maybe 4 to 5% of the individuals that are on that creation team have military experience. The
Wow.
rest have just these super advanced degrees and they create curriculum or they do all of these things,
Sure.
but there's zero cultural competence when it comes to like the military dynamic, the military thought process, how it's very different from civilian subsets, how there's a firm difference in how the approach to veterans comes about. And they take the civilian mindset and try to integrate it into a military mindset. It doesn't work. The two butt heads like this. I mean, because think about it. If they didn't butt heads, then the transition part would not be so difficult as it is for many veterans coming out. It's because
Sure.
they're not getting it that it's they're like going in two separate directions. But then you have these, big brained individuals with advanced MDs on all of these different things that do these great, amazing things, trying to integrate that into a military system or into a culture that they have no understanding of at all whatsoever. And here's the thing, I could read about military culture, like you could read about military culture all day long and have an idea, but still not have an idea of what it's like. Because the military experience itself is not something that military is not something that can be explained. It can only be experienced.
Sure. Yeah, it's impossible to put yourself in those shoes.
Yeah.
Tell me what your organization is doing for veterans returning home.
So our organization is, I mean, we're looking at spectrum, right? Overall, we're looking at improving overall quality of life. However, oftentimes when we get the veteran, they're at their wits' end. They're, have a string of destruction behind them. They're just struggling to do everyday life. Things that individuals who have never been to combat may take for granted. Um, we look at all aspects of their life, help them to not only just survive, but to thrive. And oftentimes that takes a little bit of time to be able to really help walk that veteran through the trauma, the things that they faced. We ascribe to the adage of skills over pills. We want to train that individual to think differently, and not to negate any of their military experience at all whatsoever, but just strengths based approaches to, okay, what is inside of you that's very strong, let's work on that to get you to a better place so that you're again not just surviving but you're thriving.
Sure.
Some of the suicide prevention measures and stuff that are out now, the intent and the idea is, okay, I just get you back from the edge. Well, you could do that 10 times, get them back from that edge, get them back from that edge, but the possibility of them after the 11th time of them going over that edge is super high. That's not acceptable. You have to bring them back to at least somewhere close to the starting point. You'll never get back to the same starting point, but somewhere close, and then you build protective measures in there so that they know, okay, I need to work on these specific things in order to be able to live a successful life outside of the military. Sometimes it's tied down to identity, purpose. I was given everything that I needed, that my basic needs, 4 out of the 5 Maslow's hierarchy of needs, are met and provided by the military itself. So if I transition out of the military, I lose those 4 basic needs and I have to start over. So if I have trauma, if I have other stuff on top of that, it makes it even that transition even that much more difficult.
And when you say you have these four of the five hierarchy of needs of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, what are those that the military are providing?
Let me pull those up and give you the exact because I
I was curious thinking about, what do you lose when you're returning from combat that has to be rebuilt that the military was previously providing?
So, one of the things to think about is you do not have to look very far when it comes to finding data to support the fact that many individuals that go into the military, and even data from the Vietnam War proves this to a high degree, that recruitment came from impoverished, disparaged, non nuclear families who had difficulties.
Sure. Yeah.
So,
They picked the challenged families to recruit for war.
so um, if going up to this point of joining the military, the first, let me go through the five needs, and then we'll kind of
Yeah.
dissect a little bit. So the first need is the physiological. It's the food, water, homeostasis, like
Sure.
sleep. The second level is safety needs,
Sure.
security, employment, resources, morality, family. The third is love and belonging,
Sure.
friendship and family. The fourth is esteem, the confidence, the achievement, the respect. And then
Yep.
the fifth is self actualization, um, the level where you're like, you're content. So here's the crazy thing with this. So if I come in, I've never been explained to the Maslow's hierarchy of needs. I've only been able to obtain the physiological. That's always been my survival, has always been my focus. I've never achieved any of the other levels, or maybe to some degree I have, but they've never been consistent within
Sure.
that. So if now I go into a system, even if it is chaotic,
It's
but
checking those boxes off.
I'm provided those. So there's a level of comfort that comes with that. So when I talk to this with, veterans who have spent a long time in the military, and I start going over this Maslow's hierarchy of needs and start explaining it and start getting in depth with it, they're like, well, that makes so much more sense now why I had such a hard time getting out, even though like every fiber of me wanted to get out.
Yeah.
There was something that kept pulling me back to it. Like
Yeah.
there's a comfort within it. Yeah, because your basic needs are being met within that system. And before, you've never had it. So
Yep.
now that you have it, you can identify what it is, but you know that it's there.
And then you finish your time in combat, and then it all goes away.
And then you leave the military and then you're out on your own. And again, you had no idea really what you had that was being met within that military system.
Sure.
But now you're transitioning out and you have trauma on top.
And that's a large majority.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, and here's the thing too, the military experience itself is traumatic. Now, people don't really like it when I say that, but it is. So the very threat of life is consistent and constant in military. So you're either one of two things. You're either for combat arms or you're in support of combat arms. Those are the only two like sections in the military. You have combat and support of combat. So no matter what level or degree an individual is in the military, there is always the underlying potential of someone within training exercises or whatever it is losing their life.
Sure.
And that ripple effect of that person, like they could be a mechanic working on a Humvee, and something happens and that individual dies. That ripple effect then is experienced throughout that whole unit.
Sure. It's exacerbating the risks.
Yeah. And I mean, training accidents where soldiers, where military individuals die, is you hear about them like a lot each year. Like just that a couple years ago, that Marine amphibious that one sunk, and I think 13 Marines died, and that was a training accident.
It's wild. Yeah. So
Yeah.
even if you
So
don't go into live combat, you are still susceptible to so much trauma, even on the training grounds.
yeah, and there was a study that was done too, which I find super fascinating. And it actually come to find out that individuals who did not deploy to a combat zone had a higher propensity of developing PTSD than those that did. I have my own conclusions of why that is. But it's I found it fascinating that because I was reading that going like, this doesn't make any sense. Like
Yeah.
you would think it would be the opposite,
Sure.
but it's not. I mean, it was I think there was actually two studies that showed the same thing.
Wow. What do you think the cause could be there?
Well, okay, I think some of it has to do with resiliency and the simple fact of like training. So if, let's say, for example, somebody comes to um, the military or goes to a zone, they're not necessarily being consistently trained and trained and trained and trained and trained and trained and trained. So it builds up that resiliency factor. If someone is in training or like at home, maybe they do, these training exercises here and there, and something traumatic happens, well, that buildup didn't happen within that individual to build resiliency factors to
Sure.
protect themselves against that. So that is my assumption as to why that came back. But then you also have another factor that ties into this too, and that's if individuals are coming back from combat, it's consistently whispered in their ear, don't say that anything's wrong. Don't say that anything's wrong. Don't say that anything's wrong because if you do, we'll be held back longer and you won't be able to go home.
Wow. Damned if you do, damned if you don't.
Mhm. So there's a couple of different factors of why that could be.
Yeah, that's an interesting statistic. So I'll wrap it up with kind of going back to a question or a topic we may have already addressed, but I'll bring it back to the forefront. What do you think is needed? Where do we go from here to better transition our veterans? Who takes the lead? And in your opinion, where's the government dropping the ball?
Well, I mean, we can't really deal with it at the tail end. That's what we've been doing for the last 30 years, and it's not effective. It just doesn't work. And what I mean by tail end is when a veteran is like, been out for 7, 8 years and they're presenting as suicidal.
Sure.
Well, a lot of that damage has already been done.
Yeah.
How much more effective would it be if we could catch them before like they cause a string of disasters in their own life because of the trauma, and they're not really equipped to deal with all of the trauma that they faced effectively, getting them at the when they're transitioning out, and not having the military train them how to transition out, but having individuals who are culturally competent in an organization like the PTSD Foundation of America could be one of them, and it could be others that could do it too as well. But going in and reprogramming that thought process and really kind of just helping them dial it down.
Yeah. A reintegration therapy.
Yeah.
And how long do you think? I know this is a hard question to answer, probably. What do you think is the average time needed of professional guidance to get someone reacclimated? Like, is it okay? You've been in combat for a year. You're coming home. You need 3 months of this mental and physical therapy and exercises to get you back to a starting point that was acceptable? Is it a year? Is it multiple years? How long do you think it might take on an average?
Well, I mean, many would look at it and say, well, there should be like a very strict template on what you use to kind of measure this.
Yeah,
Well, you've been in for 3 years and you had one combat deployment. This is the amount of time. But really, it's based upon the individual, like what they've experienced, how they're coping with it, how they're dealing with it. The crazy thing is you could have one person who has 6 or 7 deployments, and it could be 4 to 5 months. And then you have one who is maybe had one deployment, and it could take him 6 months.
sure,
It just depends on the individual. So that's like, the whole one size fits all approach never works. It's got to be a one size fits one. Obviously, we got to create boundaries and limitations within that,
sure.
but it should be able to be adaptable depending on the individual and their walk through. I mean, think about this for a moment. If we could do that, this issue that we have with, 44 a day that, die by self-inflicted means, we could drastically reduce that, if not just absolutely minimalize it.
If we had the right protocols.
And if we had something instituted at the end of an individual's transition out, to where it was mandatory that they, participated in this, and it done from individuals who know the culture, who have been through the culture, who understand it, who walk the
Yeah.
walk and talk the walk.
Maybe that's a requirement to continue receiving, any type of pensions or financial compensations that are owed to our veterans that risk their lives. Maybe it's a requirement to fully collect.
That'd be a difficult one, because then it'd be like, oh, well, yeah, you served 20 years, but in order for you to cash in on those 20 years that you served, you have to do like this specific thing.
Yeah. A
It,
reintegration process that becomes mandatory.
well, because one of the most important things for an individual to rehabilitate their, mind, body, and, spirit is they have to be willing to do it.
Yeah. Well, it's certainly an issue that needs a lot of attention and focus. I believe that this population deserves it more than anyone. They're the ones out. You guys are the ones out there fighting for our freedoms. So the fact that we don't have a better system it's heartbreaking, but we appreciate organizations like yours doing everything you can to try to make change and support these veterans. But it sounds like it has to happen on a larger scale with the Department of Defense and our tax dollars to create programs to help these veterans quickly, not at the end of their mental stability. I think you hit it on the head. It's right when you get home, you address these issues,
And
not a
even
few years.
before they leave the military.
Sure.
Hmm. Yeah.
Dr. Rogers, thank you so much for your time today. It's been very insightful. I think this will open up some eyes for some of our audiences tuning into our podcast on how they can get more involved and help the future of veteran healthcare. So thanks again for everything that you guys are doing.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
You have a
And individuals can learn more about our organization at www.ptsdusa.org.
Yeah, that's great. We'll make sure we include contact details. And for anyone that's listening, if you have a loved one or friend or family that's suffering, please reach out to Dr. Rogers and his team. They're looking to help as many people as they can.
Thank you.
Have a wonderful day. Take care now.